There was a lot of controversy surrounding what if Miles Morales was Thor. A lot of people felt that it was a lot of racial stereotypes. In fact, within the Hollywood Reporter, they did come out with this article, Controversial Miles Morales Story Shows Limits of Marvel Comics by Richard Newby. And I think the author actually makes a lot of good points, but he also makes some really strange points within this. And I wanted to talk to my good friend Gevian Dargan about it. How you doing, Gevian?
I'm doing good, Wes. How are you today?
I'm doing all right. You finally got to read What If Miles Morales was Thor?
Yeah, it took me a minute to go find it, but I'm going to give a shout out to First Aid Comics. They had like about 3 copies left of one of the variant covers. So I picked it up, and yeah, it was all that I hoped and dreamed and dreaded. So
this is the first thing that really caught my eye. He says, we've seen some of the possibilities of Miles Morales reflected within the Oscar-winning animated film Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and the stellar PlayStation game Spider-Man Miles Morales. Anyone can be Spider-Man, but the recent blowback from the comic issue What If Miles Morales Became Thor begs another question. Can anyone write Spider-Man? And he does talk about how those two projects had a lot of black creators associated with them.
This ultimately is about the process. It's about the creative team process, the editorial process, the team that was put together around those two writers that allowed for a more authentic version of Miles Morales to come out. Or I would even say a brand new version of Miles Morales to come out than what's going on at Marvel. And I think that's the strength of this article, is that this is really a black eye as to what Marvel is doing in terms of the editorial process, the hiring process, and basically some of the prejudices of the people who worked it at some of the highest positions. So, yeah.
He definitely gets to that point eventually, and I think he makes that point really well, but I think he throws me off with the article because he does say this kind of before he gets to his really good material. In the 11 years Miles Morales has been swinging, he's never had a black or Afro-Latino writer on his solo title. That's a problem, and it's a problem that has created issues with the character from the very beginning. Writer Brian Michael Bendis and artist Sarah Pichelli created Miles with the best of intentions. Of that, I have no doubt. He later continues, by all accounts, Bendis, who identifies as Jewish, is someone who cares deeply about representation in comics and is an essential voice in the modern age of comics. Yet, as a white man, there are inherent limitations in his approach to Miles Morales, ones that the character hasn't been able to shake. The two things that he's talking about there are that Miles's father's name is Jefferson Davis, which happens to also be the name of the president of the Confederate States, but also that Miles' father works as a police officer. And in that, he says Miles' identity, shaped by his father's given backstory, has left the young hero tied to America's history of slavery and policing. I think he goes far too far with those leaps in logic as to why Miles Morales currently isn't working and why we're not getting like a really good presentation of the character. I think he was kind of grasping for things there before he kind of brings it back to some things that make more sense to me.
Yeah, no, and this is where great minds think alike, Wes, because I thought the exact same thing when I read the article. It was just like, I don't know if this was like an obligatory, what we now call woke shout out or call out, just to like, you know, get your bona fides in, or, you know, maybe you have the credentials, but it's like, you know, look, it's like, I mean, that would be like saying like Viola Davis, because she had the last name Davis, is tied to a history of, you know, if anybody had the last name Jefferson, it's like, you know, you're tied to the history of miscegenation. It's like, come on, it's like surnames are surnames. My last name is Dargan, which basically ties me to basically Irish culture and to whoever the Irish slave owner that it was that had the plantation from which my surname apparently or allegedly was derived from. I mean, that's actually a reflection of the history. It doesn't tie you down in any way, I would say, unless you let it. And then the second thing about the whole thing about being a cop is like, I'm creating a black character, working on a black character whose father is a cop and a mother who's a cop. I know plenty of people who are black cops. In popular culture, one of the most, I would say, popular and well-loved TV series is Family Matters, where the father's Officer Carl Winslow, who was a cop. I think he's just reaching for things to make his point, but I think overall, I would even question even the premise of it where he basically starts off with that, can anyone write Spider-Man? I say, yeah, anyone can write Spider-Man. I don't think that's the issue. Christopher Priest and Jim Owsley wrote Spider-Man. Not a question write Spider-Man. The question is, can anyone write Miles Morales? And in this case, apparently no. That's the answer, is no. Just not anyone can write Miles Morales. You have to be talented, and I think somewhat good at your job, or at least be in the right creative environment to do that. as Into the Spider-Verse bears out. So
yeah, because there are a lot of issues with Marvel Comics' use of Miles Morales. It hasn't really stood out, and he hits those very well. I think he laid out the problems with Miles Morales in a very good way. He says, while the idea of a black Spider-Man is rebellious in nature, his characterization isn't, and his actions as Spider-Man do little to disturb the status quo. There's still something about his personality that aimed at making him seem non-threatening, a fearful hesitancy in making him anything other than a young paragon. Too often it feels that Miles is treated to Peter Parker's leftovers since he entered the 616 universe sharing the title of Spider-Man, but getting half the attention. And he is in Peter Parker's shadow. Any character that calls himself Spider-Man is living in Peter Parker's shadow and is going to be getting his leftovers. That's why he needs his own identity.
Well, yeah, that's because it's derivative. I mean, he makes a great point about talking about the progress of Miles's other media depictions of ones that he, I hope to see implemented in Miles Morales' comic appearances. And what's becoming apparent is that it's the comic book Miles Morales that's the problem. Other people apparently in other mediums can take the character and basically make him into a character, make him one that's likable and that's relatable. As I said, when we went to see the movie, the young white kid in front of us is dancing around going, Black Spider-Man is the best ever, because that Miles Morales and Into the Spider-Verse. And I have not read the comics to the extent, so I'm relying on other people's interpretation and observations of this, is that character was significantly different and more fleshed out than anything that's been done in comics, as Newbie points out, in over 11 years. But I also think the other problem is that, and this is another issue I took with Newbie in terms of talking about this, where basically he says that as a result, Miles often has fallen to the trope of the stoic black male, good, serious, and even-tempered. And for the most part, I consider myself just that, good, serious, and even-tempered. I consider my father to be good, serious, and even-tempered. I know plenty of black men who are good, serious, and even-tempered. I didn't realize I was a trope. I was like that as a teenager. And I know other guys who also were like that as a teenager. Now, were we like that as teenagers because that was just our natural disposition? Or were we like that as teenagers because we realized that we couldn't be threatening, or we couldn't be assertive, or we couldn't be ourselves in a world that takes everything that we do as a threat? And see, those are the things that you could explore in terms of the character of Miles Morales and have an honest conversation about. But it's like to say that somebody like that is a trope. I think that's a slap in the face to a bunch of black men like myself. And I think in that case, Newbie is also operating in a way that he's decrying, which is that you're saying that black people are basically monoliths. So in other words, you can't be good, serious, you can't be good, serious, and even-tempered. You have to be rebellious or always talking against the man, or out protesting Black Lives Matter. It's like that's just as much of a stereotype as
I think he's
anything
saying
Mercado did.
The representation of black men in Marvel Comics is monolithic. Because if you look at the black characters that have been created in the last 15 years, they're almost all kind of the same character. Like, I remember when you and I were younger. Yes, we used to be young men. We're about the same age. Like, black culture was cool. Like, if you're in a little town in the country like me, like, you saw it like, oh wow, black folks have the better music. They're playing all the great sports. Everything's cool about black culture, and they've almost like ripped a lot of that stuff out of it. They're not allowed to celebrate black culture or even let Miles Morales be cool in the comic books, and they don't do that with any of the other characters either.
What was it about Static that was necessarily rebellious? Well, nothing rebellious about Static. Virgil Hawkins was not like this, man, I'm down with the call. He was nothing like that. He wasn't. He was a dealer on the side. He just wasn't. He was a good, serious, even-tempered kid. He just dealt with situations.
I think he just had a better writer.
He had a better writer. No,
there's
and that's what we're talking
about him that isn't there with Miles and other characters.
Somebody sat down and took pieces of their life and tried to find the most relatable pieces and just told it from a black point of view. And that's all you're talking about. And with Miles, the problem is that Miles has never been, and on some level, can never be his own man, because he's Spider-Man. He's Spider-Man, and he's carrying the mantle, the legacy of Spider-Man.
Yeah, it's kind of weird that, this character that is just desperately in search of his own identity, it's the what if Miles Morales was every character but himself, kind of gets him in trouble. But he does address that. He says, of course, that changed a couple of weeks ago, though not in the way anyone wanted. What if Miles Morales became Thor, written by Yehudi Mercado and art by Paco Medina and Luigi Zagoria? is part of a miniseries featuring alternate scenarios for Morales' legacy, heroism. The issue rightfully came under fire for stereotypical language featured in this issue, which has its roots in racism, prejudice, and the idea of blackness as monolithic. The end result of Miles Morales' depiction in this issue is blackness as a pistache of elements viewed through a white lens, and a reminder that even as superheroes, we are identified not as individuals, but a collation of appropriated concepts placed within a contextless vacuum.
The problem with the idea of blackness as a monolith is not that we as black people see ourselves as all thinking the same way or being the same way. I think if you're in America, there was definitely a point where if you were a black man or a black woman or a black person, it was expected that you would have certain ideas about the society, how we should relate to one another, and how we should relate to primarily white society. And even that was false at the time, because there was long traditions of black conservatism, for instance, that went far beyond when I got introduced to that way of thinking, was making my way through the world and black culture at the time. But the thing is that what I do argue is monolithic is the way others treat and look at and perceive black people, whether it's black people from America, black people from Africa, black people from the African diaspora. That's where the monolithic view comes from. So for him to just lay just on white people, it's like, nah, bro. A whole bunch of people have that view of black people.
I can tell you, if you go to Asia,
as we shared through pop culture.
If you go to Korea, people might think that you rap, just because that's almost all the representation that people outside of the United States, see black people. It's mostly through U.S. entertainment, and it's almost monolithic as far as the treatment of black folks. You don't see very many of the best man, where you have business type young black professionals going up and having like this angsty stuff between them because they have this wedding to go to. And you're like, oh, this is pretty refreshing. You just don't see black people treated like that in movies. And, it felt really strange. But I liked it.
And it goes both ways. It's just like, if I find myself now and deeply immersed in a white evangelical Christian culture. Back when I was in New York, I had a very different idea of white evangelical Christian was like. And believe me, it was just like this. It was very narrow. It's just like this. But that's because we get so much of our exposure, whether it's initially or continually, is through pop culture. It's through media in particular, and the dissemination of media. So this is why a lot of people say, oh, representation don't count, and want to dismiss it with cries of and protests of wokeness. It's like the reason why people are saying you need to have representation in media. No, I'm not arguing. I'm not with now. Again, this right here is an example of what's the difference between good and bad representation. But the simple fact of the matter is, it is powerful. Representation is powerful. It's happening whether you like it or not. So the thing is that what you want to do is you want to strive for a quality representation of people, and that's all people, and not just this representation that is controlled by one group. Kevin Grievous, who some of you know is the creator of Black Marvel, wrote the Underworld thing. He posted up. He had a Facebook post, and and basically, I'll just pick out a couple of key points here. I mean, he definitely lays out all the things, but he starts off with Better Ray Bill, an alien got a better hookup than Brother Miles, and a new hammer to boot, which Thor's repping in all the MCU movies right now. So he's like saying, now I'm not one that believes all black characters should be written by black creators. After all, very few of the black characters that we know and love, like Black Panther, Blade, Black Lightning, Cyborg, were created by black creators. Because if so, then we would have to logically concede that we, to our black people, black creators, shouldn't be the regular writers on the main Iron Man, Wonder Woman, Flash, Batman, etc. But he's saying, but this right here is what happens when we're not in the room and part of the decision-making process when it comes to creating our own images. So he poses the question, are we that unwanted? And when we do create our own images, do they try to keep us away from them after conception so they can insert their own views about who they want us to be and how they want us to be perceived? And then he basically ends up, does this topic really have to be that difficult? And he says, I think they sincerely want diversity. They just don't want diversity from us. And I think that's what this particular book is lifting the rug up on what's going on at Marvel and probably DC and probably the comic industry at large. This never should have made it past editorial in the first place.
Yeah, this is what he had to say.
Go ahead.
He says the issue with What If story is that it never should have made it past editorial in the first place. The issue with the comic is the culture of Marvel Comics, whose hiring practices in terms of artists and writers don't match the commitment to inclusivity in the pages of their books. The company has notably hired what are essentially celebrity writers like Ta-Nehisi Coates, John Ridley, Roxane Gay, Jeffrey Thorne, and Reginald Hudlin, who got their start outside of comic books.
Ta-Nehisi Coates got to write Black Panther because he wrote this article, this much lauded article in the Atlantic about reparations. That's why he got the job. Not because he actually liked comics, loved comics, knew how to write a comic. It was just because of his celebrity based on that and the PR he could draw as a result of that. But I think this goes a little bit deeper than that. I mean, this is like, as Newbie says, I think he says a little bit later on in the article. He said, rather than solely, no, what he says, after all, how can these modern myths reflect our contemporary world that the people telling these stories are limited by a corporate clubhouse mentality that has made little progress over the decades? Rather than solely place the blame at Mercado's feet, the recent controversy feels like a signal for Marvel to further expand its talent pool and let creators fully understand why these characters matter so much to their own representation to take the lead. Marvel Comics not only has the power to do so and play on words, but the responsibility. And I think that's what's the underlying issue here. This is the part that nobody wants to talk about, is that in comics in general, and in life in general, and in politics in general, and in Black people's dealing with the rest of the culture in particular, and yeah, I'm going to say, even though I got blasted about this before the last time I said it, the white liberals, are these people really our allies? Are they really your allies? If they just want to keep it engaging in these forms of polite racism, where it's like, yeah, we want you guys on board in this and that, but, we want you to be involved here, but not over here. We're glad you created this character here, but yeah, we don't ever want you to touch it again. We're gonna do this here. If they're all gonna be a bunch of Bruce Wayne NIMBYs, where it's always like, yeah, I'm down for the cause, but not when the cause basically affects me or ends up in my backyard, then what are we really talking about? And this ain't nothing new. This is nothing new. This is what both Martin Luther King, whom everybody in the world loves to quote when it comes to have a dream and wants to talk about why there should be a meritocracy and everything else. And both Malcolm X said the exact same thing when it came to all the liberals. And I like to quote, because Martin Luther King did say this in one of his speeches. He said the white moderate was more of an obstacle than the Ku Klux Klaner. And he actually called for a liberalism which was truly liberal. One that rises up with righteous indignation when a Negro is lynched in Mississippi, but will be equally incensed when a Negro is denied the right to live in his neighborhood. And you don't even want to get into Malcolm X, because Malcolm X just kind of says the worst enemy that the Negro have is this white man that runs around here drooling at the mouth, professing to love Negroes and calling himself a liberal, and it is following these white liberals that's perpetuated problems that Negroes have. If the Negro wasn't taken, tricked, or deceived by the white liberal, the Negroes would get together and solve our own problems. I only cite these things to show you that in America, the history of the white liberal has been nothing but a series of trickery designed to make Negroes think that the white liberal is going to solve our problems. Our problems will never be solved by the white man. And then he also says, he says that both the white conservative and the white liberal want power, but that the white liberal was only different than the white conservative in one way, which is that the white liberal was more deceitful and hypocritical, by posing as the Negro's friend and benefactor. It's like, bro, this stuff is this. And now all that it seems like has happened is, and I think based on what people are sharing, is that kind of spirit, that kind of cultural dynamic, that kind of NIMBYism, that like I like to call it, is alive and well at Marvel Comics. Because with all due respect, Yuhito Mercado, I don't know exactly how he got the assignment, what directives he was given, whatever else. But at the end of the day, while he has some responsibility for this, so does everyone else in that creative team. And ultimately, the responsibility for this falls on the shoulders and the prejudices of Tom Groneman, Nick Lowe, and C.B. Cebulski. That's who this falls on.
But I will give the author of the article this. He does break it down at the very end. This is what Newbie has to say. This isn't to say that only Black or Afro-Latino creators should tackle characters who share their racial identity. But given how many of them are fighting their way to get into the industry on their own talent and how many characters are now populating the Marvel Universe, it feels as though the comic book landscape is in need of some drastic changes behind the scenes. I don't want to see people limited in their own creativity by their own race. I think that is regressive. That is not progressive in nature.
Well,
but we should have some mechanisms in place. We should have some more representation within the creators. I like the idea of what Marvel, not Marvel, but DC are doing with the Milestone Initiative. They're actually going out there and they're putting their money where their mouth is. And I'd say you and I had talked about this in the past. If you want to get new creators of color, you're going to have to go out to them and you're going to have to go nurture that talent. You're going to have to go out there and mentor them and get them into the industry. Because right now they don't all feel like there's an opportunity there. And DC at least are doing something, which I can't say for Marvel, from all appearances.
And I'll say this, even with the Milestone Initiative, which we had talked about that at length. And I was a big proponent of it in terms of just like, you got to build the next generation. And then even some people can say, hey, but Dargan, when you look at those commercials they've been running, it's like they're kind of making the hood look like Black Asgard did. And I say, yeah, media has to do a better job of presenting every little aspect, nook and cranny and nuance of what the community is. But you're not going to do that. You're not going to do that when you basically have a group of people up at the top who basically have some poor prejudices about the people that they are trying to target and or represent. This came up as a dirty little secret. I can't corroborate it, but it was definitely a rumor I heard many, many times that even when Milestone originally launched, that the reason why Milestone received such little marketing support in terms of their books getting into stores and promotional stuff was that whoever was involved in the marketing department at the time literally said in the meeting in front of other people, Black people don't read comics. And that's going back again, 30-something years. And I just think something like this just represents that, like somebody has said when in the aficionados in the comment thread that, did Gevian just say that basically you ain't Black? And even my presenting of something this may be problematic. So I'm not going to say that somebody isn't Black, but what I am saying is that there was a character that is actually more problematic, though not as popular as Miles, more problematic than this interpretation of Miles as Thor. There was a character that I actually enjoyed at the time, which was Big Lob from G.I. Joe. And if any of you are familiar with G.I. Joe, the movie, oh my God, you want to talk about a stereotype, please. Before The Rock and before Deion Sanders, that was Big Lob. But you know what? You want to know what else there is that's interesting about Big Lob? That was 1987, okay? We are now in 2022. You can't do Big Lob anymore. As much as Big Lob's beloved by me, my brothers, and those of us who watch G.I. Joe, that was 1987. On some level, we realized, given who's writing it and what's going on, that's about the best we can get. It's 2022, y'all. This don't have to happen no more. This is lazy. This is lazy. And to your point about having mechanisms, you don't want, and Josh and I discussed this during the aficionados thing, you don't want something where it just becomes just like, okay, he's Black, rubber stamp. He's going to do a great job on this character no matter what. No, that's what got affirmative action in trouble in the first place. Because affirmative action was a response to the fact that you had laws in place, and you had programs in place, and unfortunately, the majority white society wasn't doing the right thing. So then you had to put mechanisms in place to basically get the representation in society that you want. Then, of course, the implementation of affirmative action was lazy because it's like, look, is he Black? Get him in there. No vetting, no qualifying. And look, guys, this goes on all over society with different effort groups in different areas of life. It's called failing upwards. It's called failing upwards. It means you rise to a position simply because of a key factor of your identity or your demographic, not because you actually know what you're doing. Y'all know what I'm talking about. Y'all work for some of them right now. I work for some of them now. Well, he's been here for 20 years, or seniority. He's been here for 20 years, and he's a great guy. He's always shown up. We should just make him the manager of the whole department, even though he's shown no aptitude for the job whatsoever during that time. So we just need to do better. I think I tip my hat to Mercado to at least listening to the people who pointed out what the problem was. I think even that was problematic because I'm like, all these Black and brown creators come out after the fact to say, yo, man, that joint was wrong. It's like, none of y'all saw this before. Something just ain't right at the House of Ideas. That's at the end of the day. And they got a lot more. They need a bigger fix. Mercado handing over his paycheck for one issue.
Definitely want to say thank you very much to Gevian for showing up and giving his thoughts on that article. I thought it was a really good conversation. If you're not exactly certain what we were talking about, or you want some more details about this, what if Miles Morales was Thor, I did kind of a breakdown of the issue and some of the issues that people had with it, some of the controversy, some of the stereotypes that were present in it. Definitely check this out for more information.